Now, we haven't heard much in the way of solutions from the government on the fuel crisis, but with Tory conference starting on Sunday, is that about to change? The Conservatives go into their annual meeting with a very comfortable majority, but after a difficult month following on from the unveiling of the national insurance tax hike to pay for health and social care. To discuss how it will go, I'm joined by our political editor, James Forsyth, and Tory MP, Iain Duncan Smith. James, Iain, thanks for joining me. James first, Tory Party conference starts on Sunday, but we're in the middle of both a gas price and fuel crisis. Is this a chance to reset the agenda?
I think if you'd said this will be the first Tory conference after the party wins an 80-seat majority, you would have thought that it would be a kind of champagne-fueled kind of victory bash. But obviously, a lot has happened since the Tories won that victory in December 2019. And I think there's obviously not only the kind of short-term concerns prompted by the petrol crisis and these rising gas prices and what they mean for the winter ahead, but I also think there is a kind of bigger nagging philosophical question bugging a lot of Tories right now, which is kind of, what is the purpose of this government? This government was essentially elected in 2019 to kind of get Brexit done and keep Jeremy Corbyn out. And it has done both of those things now. You then obviously had the pandemic, which took up nearly all of the government's bandwidth and time. And so now the question is, what is the government's post-pandemic agenda? And I think that is what they are going to need to flesh out in Manchester next week.
And no doubt the party will be looking backward to the victories that it had even before the COVID crisis hit. But still, these are not ideal circumstances to be heading into the Tories party conference.
Well, we have to say, first of all, that COVID is like a war in the sense that it's knocked the agenda of the government such as it existed back in the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. It's knocked it, it's punched a hole through it, really. So recovering out of COVID a year and a half into a government means that we're almost starting from scratch in a sense. So this conference is the first public conference, but it's also almost really the first conference because everything else has been COVID. So the questions that we pose is what kind of government are we going to be as a Conservative government? And I think the range of options lies clearly behind sort of Ted Heathian government or a Margaret Thatcher style government where it's a case of low taxes and lower spending and greater booming economy, private sector taking over. So the question really is, where do we lie on the spectrum of that, and where do those phrases build back better and levelling up, what do they actually mean when you get to test them in the arena of political decision? So those are the big questions that will be posed. There are a lot of funny and strange answers that are already coming out. In the midst of that, it's worth reminding ourselves of Macmillan's "What do I fear most?" Events, dear boys, events. And the truth is, we are facing also, within all of that, a set of events post-COVID, a lot of them coming out of COVID, which will, almost like earthquakes, have seismic shocks that go through the system. One is the whole failure on haulage drivers because they shut down every single testing centre stupidly during the course of COVID. That's exacerbated an already existing problem. The mendacity and peculiar selfishness of many of the haulier companies who have invested next to nothing in their drivers for so long, being torn away by cheap labour from Eastern Europe. All of these were meant to be Brexit questions that were settled, but where we find actually Brexit is still looming in the mirror because these are still there and they're causing us problems. So competence is critical. How do we display that? We have to be free of this petrol pump problem by the time we get to the conference. And then it's about policy and direction and sending us off believing that we have a purpose.
James, let's talk about the definitions of these slogans, because when you scroll through the fringe guide for Tory Party conference, levelling up is undoubtedly one of the most popular topics. Do you think we're going to learn over the next few days what the slogan actually means?
I think the question of what does levelling up mean? Now, I think everyone knows what it means in terms of the long term. I think the challenge for the government
I honestly don't. Genuinely.
Okay, I think
does it mean tax rises, which we've had? Does it mean tax breaks for people who are on lower incomes? I have no idea, to be honest, what the long-term agenda of the Tory Party is.
Long term, the aim is that every part of a country should be as prosperous as London and the South East. That is obviously the kind of utopian kind of Boris Johnson view of what levelling up means. I think that obviously the more complicated question is, how do you get there and what are the stops along the way? Now, Boris Johnson he wants a very broad definition of levelling up. He thinks the fact that it encompasses lots of things is part of its appeal. I actually think you need a much tighter definition of levelling up around boosting economic growth in the regions and devolving power down. I think one of the things that you see is this is still a very centralised country, and I think if you look at those bits of England which are doing well in terms of inward investment and the like, they are often places that have a mayor, someone who can act to corral investment there, bring people together, make sure things work. And I think that those should be the two big levers that the government tries to pull on levelling up, which is one of which is giving away power and down to a local level. And I think the problem of levelling up is at the moment is that it is in danger of becoming like Build Back Better. It's just in danger of becoming a slogan that the government attaches to everything it does rather than a policy agenda.
James, what do you think the Prime Minister wants to get out of his party conference?
I think we've interviewed Dominic Raab for the magazine this week, and he mentioned delivery probably more times in that interview than any other single word. You look at the kind of every clip Boris Johnson does right now, it's about delivery. I think he wants to give this sense that the government is getting back on with stuff post-COVID and is doing what it said it would do. I think that's what Boris Johnson thinks is the most important message for him to get out of that conference. I think that the challenge for him is on, they often talk about social care, for example, and the health and social care levy is an example of delivery. It's not yet delivery. It's a decision to raise taxes, to put more money into the NHS and to, in time, find more money for social care. It's not actually delivering that new system. And I think in one of the things that Iain said that COVID was like a war, I think one of the other things we forget is just how much of this parliament COVID has already taken up. This government is operating on a very compressed timetable if it wants to make visible changes to people's lives by the next election.
And Iain, this brings us back to a point that you raised at the start of this discussion, which is that the Tories have this big question hovering over them. What kind of party do they want to be? Do they want to be more interventionist, more big state? Do they want to go down eventually a lower tax route? What would you like to see from the Tory Party, and what are you hoping to hear at conference?
Well, actually, now on the positive side, we've talked a lot about the problems, but the truth is there are some big positives for this government if they have the energy and the courage to seize them. We left the European Union. One of the key reasons why, if not almost the most important reason why, is when we say take back control, it's about what do we believe in regulation? What's the level of regulation that should be set, the interference in people's lives? I was asked by the Prime Minister to do a report. It's called the Tigger Report, and it's about what can we do to deregulate and change. And we came forward with a significant number, over 100 recommendations, but more importantly, to shift the concept of regulation, not to an absolutely over-intrusive process that says, if anything could go wrong, we have to measure that before it happens, and actually allow, as they do in common law, iterative change. Now, that means basically the real underpinning of this economy is about how you make the UK economy light on its feet, very inventive. All the innovation areas from medical tech through to financial technology, all of these things are all there for us to grab, but we have to be bold. And this government in the next year, and this is pretty much all it's got, has got to shift mountains in terms of regulation. It's got to make sure that we are a very attractive place, the most attractive place in Europe to invest money in, because we're the place where you can build these things. We can compete with California because we know where we're going. There's no reason why you should be governed by companies in California. You need to change the rules around GDPR, allow people to take greater control. There is a whole report, and it's good that David Frost is now going to drive that through government. But it requires government ministers not to be bound down by civil servants and to make those changes. If we do that, this will open up the British economy after COVID, and it will make us a really powerful force for innovation. All these technologies are in existence here at a time when we have real issues over how we trade with China and various others. the UK could be a real hub for all of this. I would drive that now. That is what I believe levelling up is all about, because it'll bring business to areas around the UK other than London that can actually develop these technologies and be at the heart of it. That gives business entrepreneurship and real rises in salaries, away from all those cheap salaries that we thought we could pay previously, and now into serious value-added work that we could do. This is the UK that voted to leave the European Union. If we don't do that, there was no purpose in us leaving at all.
But Iain,
levelling up
is this
requires
government going to deregulate?
It has to be. It has to be. It's not just. I'm not talking about casual
deregulation.
Well, David Frost is now being tasked with that, and that's the one brilliant thing that has happened. I know that he's really focused on this, and lots of people don't understand what we mean by deregulation. It's not slash and burn. It's about resetting the whole nature of how we look at regulation in the way in which we deal, for example, with common law. It's about, if we don't know whether it's dangerous, we don't legislate for it. We let ourselves discover those things and only intervene when it's necessary. This is the whole key to it. And with that, there is huge areas in medical technology which the UK is already to lead. We could be blowing that right out the water. The same with fintech and everything else. They're right on the cusp. The UK could be that nation that literally competes with the best in the world. But it requires us to take advantage of leaving the European Union. This is the test. Are we serious? Are we brave? Are we bold? And will we do it? Because if we meander around in the next year and a half trying to figure out what we're going to do in the short term, it's not going to work. Levelling up and building back better are about getting the UK the most flexible nation in Europe and also competing on that global stage. And that requires us to shift the burden of regulation and innovation so that we bring businesses here to the UK.
And what's the mood of the Tory MPs going into party conference?
Well, it's difficult. They're still upbeat. We won a big majority. Labour, as we see in this Labour conference, is still at each other. Yes, there's been some improvement in a way in some of their rules, but the truth is Labour still doesn't quite know where it's going. It's still made a series of hostages to fortune. So the Tories coming into the conference will still feel upbeat. They still feel that, in Boris they've got probably the world's best political salesman. And you do need a good salesman at the helm, but we also need good strategy as well, and that's important. But, I think they're still upbeat, but they're beginning to get concerned that we need to see some pace on all of this. And we're not the party that spends its time raising taxes. We've got to be in the business of getting the economy right. And many of them have said to me, what we need to do is treat the debt like war debt from COVID and get on to really engineer this economy, get lower taxes, get lower regulation, and really make this economy zing. If we do that, we'll be able to pay back the debt at a more accelerated pace. But first, let's get the economy moving and not do things like raising national insurance and for things that will never happen. I mean, honestly, if anyone believes the health service in 3 years' time is going to give back any money to social services, then I have to say they haven't been in politics very long.
James, we are getting tax rises. The economy, we don't know if it's stagnated, but the figures from August were extremely disappointing. What sense are you picking up from Tory MPs? Is there this optimism that Iain points to, or are some of them slightly more depressed?
I think there is a desire for a greater sense of what the Tory Party is for, what the government is for. That point about, post-Brexit, post-COVID, what is the government trying to do? I actually think if I was a Tory MP, the thing that would have alarmed me most this week was Andrew Bailey's speech on Monday evening, saying that the recovery is already weakening, warning about the dangers of having to put up interest rates because of inflation, but with the economy not being strong enough or robust enough to take that. And his warning that these supply and labour shortages are going to get worse, not better. And his warning that this autumn is going to be hard yards. I think it is that economic backdrop that is the biggest risk to the Tories. And I think, as Iain was saying in one of his earlier answers, the government, this autumn is going to be difficult, in part because of some delayed shocks from COVID, some Brexit adjustments. And I think the government has to give a sense that it is in charge, that it knows what it is doing, that it is not being buffeted by events.
James, last question to you. What should SpecTV watchers be looking out for at Tory Party conference? Any tensions, any major moments that you would be looking for?
I think the interesting question is I think there is a bubbling away under the surface, and it might come to the surface given that this is the first in-person conference in such a long time, is the question of, what is the point of the Tory Party? Has it become... one senior Tory said to me recently, we were elected as Thatcherites, we govern as goalists. Has the Tory Party now essentially become a goalist party, or is it going to go back more to that kind of the kind of Thatcherite settlement? So I think watch that question, and then I think also watch to see in this debate about the post-Brexit adjustment. I mean, you see this very interestingly. Dominic Raab in this interview for the Spectator this week is very explicit. But basically, if you were to issue 100,000 visas to lorry drivers, as Keir Starmer is suggesting, he says that wouldn't solve this country's being hooked on cheap labour. It would just be a sticking plaster solution, and that the only solution, he argues, is to kind of raise wages in all of these jobs where firms struggle to find enough British workers to fill the gaps. I think that the tension between that thinking and the desire to make sure that Christmas is uninterrupted, I think that is going to be something that bubbles along at this conference. And also related to that, the whole question of the Tory Party's relationship with business, I think is going to become an increasingly interesting question. To what extent, should the Tory Party be doing what kind of business wants in terms of immigration and the like, or to what extent should the government be saying to business, no, you're going to have to pay people more, invest more in training? I think those three tensions are the things that I'll be looking out for. I don't think you'll see that much of it on the conference platform, but I think on the conference fringe, and in the bars, those will be the big questions being debated.